My beloved child, the quietest conversation can sometimes carry the deepest meaning, and somewhere behind everything you have been noticing lately, a second party has been holding words they were never quite ready to say aloud. Not words of rivalry. Not words meant to disturb your peace. Something far more unexpected. They have been thinking about you, about the person you love, and, most surprisingly, about your family. And when those thoughts became too heavy to keep circling silently inside them, they turned toward God. What they said was simple at first, almost hesitant, as though even they were surprised by what was forming in their heart. But then came a promise. A private promise they never expected you to hear about. Don't skip, because the meaning of that promise becomes clearer only when you understand what happened before it was spoken. This second party had been watching certain things from a distance, the way your name could subtly change the atmosphere of a conversation, the way someone seemed more thoughtful whenever your future was mentioned, the way questions about family suddenly carried a deeper weight. None of these moments seemed dramatic by themselves. Yet together, they created a picture this person could no longer ignore. They began wondering whether your presence represented something larger than a passing connection. Perhaps that is why their prayer was not really about removing you from the story. It was about understanding why you seemed to matter so much inside it. And that realization changed the direction of everything they were about to say. Strangely, the promise was born from a question rather than an answer. What if this connection is meant to bring peace instead of confusion? What if the family everyone has been quietly thinking about is not standing at the edge of this story, but somewhere near its center? The second party wrestled with that possibility longer than anyone knew. They had assumptions. They had expectations. They may even have imagined the future unfolding differently. Yet slowly, those expectations began giving way to something more mature, acceptance that not every meaningful relationship can be understood from the outside. So when they spoke to God about you, they did not ask for control over what happened next. They asked for clarity. They asked for wisdom. And then, almost unexpectedly, they made the promise connected to your family. Stay till the end, because the promise itself is not what makes this moment remarkable. It is what they were willing to do because of it. They quietly decided that if your intentions were sincere, if the person you love truly found peace around you, and if your connection could eventually bring two sides closer rather than pull people apart, they would not become an obstacle simply because the outcome was different from what they once imagined. Think about the weight of that for a moment. Someone who could have held tightly to their own expectations was beginning to consider stepping aside from them. Not because they had lost something, but because they were starting to understand something. Then came the detail nobody expected them to mention. Your family. Until this point, much of their thinking had centered on you as an individual, but suddenly they began speaking about the people who shaped you, the values you carry, the kind of home you may hope to build someday, and the quiet responsibilities you seem to take seriously. Somewhere along the way, they had learned, or simply sensed, that loving you could never be separated completely from respecting where you came from. That was when the secret promise became more specific. They promised that if the moment ever arrived when families had to understand one another, they would choose dignity over unnecessary tension. They would not deliberately create misunderstanding. They would not use private knowledge to embarrass anyone. And if they were ever asked what they truly believed about you, they would speak from what they had genuinely observed rather than from old assumptions. Something important is waiting for you here, because this promise reveals a change that may be far more significant than any dramatic declaration. The second party was beginning to see you differently. But there is another layer, and this is where the story becomes unusually personal. They remembered something you may not even realize anyone noticed. A small moment. Perhaps it was something you said, something you refused to say, or simply the way you handled a situation without making yourself the center of it. Whatever it was, it stayed with them. At first they dismissed it. Later they returned to it. Then they began comparing that moment with other things they had heard about you. Slowly, a question formed: have I misunderstood this person? That question followed them into the conversation with God. And once it was there, they could no longer pretend their original picture of you was complete. The promise about your family came partly from this realization. They did not want an incomplete judgment to become the reason good people were treated unfairly. They wanted, in their own quiet way, to leave room for truth to reveal itself naturally. And perhaps that is the rarest part of this entire situation. Not that someone suddenly changed sides, but that someone became willing to question their own certainty. A softer truth began emerging after that. The person you love had apparently revealed more through their behavior than through their words. The second party had noticed it. Whenever conversations moved toward the future, something shifted. Your name did not feel casual anymore. Questions about commitment, family, stability, and belonging seemed to carry another meaning beneath the surface. Nobody needed to announce it. The pattern was becoming visible. And the second party finally understood why they had felt compelled to bring you before God in the first place. They were standing close enough to this story to realize that whatever happened next could affect more hearts than their own. That recognition humbled them. Their prayer became less about what they wanted and more about hoping everyone involved would eventually find the courage to be truthful, respectful, and kind. Yet one sentence they spoke remained especially private. One sentence connected directly to your family. And if that sentence reaches the person you love, it could completely change how this second party is understood. Because the promise was not simply, "I will stay out of the way." It carried something deeper. In their own words and in their own private way, they expressed that they would protect the dignity of your family if difficult questions ever surfaced. They would not turn personal circumstances into gossip. They would not make your loved ones feel smaller simply because the situation was complicated. And most unexpectedly, they hoped that if two families ever found themselves facing one another, the meeting would begin with respect rather than assumptions. That may sound simple, but simplicity can hide enormous emotional growth. A person who once looked at this story from the outside was beginning to recognize that real people, real families, and real feelings were involved. The mystery is not whether everything suddenly becomes perfect. Real life rarely moves that way. The mystery is why this change happened now. There was a reason. And it began with something the second party recently discovered about the person you love. Not a scandal. Not something frightening. Something quiet. Yet revealing enough to make them reconsider nearly everything. They realized that the person you love had been carrying a certain concern about your family for longer than anyone suspected. It was not about rejection. It was not about escaping responsibility. It was almost the opposite. They were thinking about how to approach things properly. How to avoid disrespect. How to make sure that when important conversations finally happened, nobody felt ignored or treated as an afterthought. The second party saw this and understood that your connection had reached a level of seriousness they had underestimated. Suddenly, their prayer made sense even to themselves. Suddenly, that secret promise felt necessary. And there is one more detail they have not revealed yet. The second party knows that a conversation involving your family may be closer than you think. Not because destiny has guaranteed a particular ending, but because someone has already begun considering what they would say if that conversation happened. They have mentally rehearsed it. They have wondered which questions might be asked. They have even thought about how your name should be introduced so that the people important to you understand the sincerity behind it. But what the second party knows about that possible conversation is only half the story. The other half belongs to the person you love, because they recently said something about your family when they believed this second party would keep it completely private. And those words explain why the prayer happened, why the promise was made, and why someone who once seemed uncertain about you is now quietly preparing to do something no one expected. The sentence was almost missed because it was spoken so calmly. There was no dramatic announcement, no attempt to impress anyone, and no carefully prepared explanation. The person you love simply said something about your family that made the second party become unusually quiet. If this ever becomes serious enough to bring our families together, I want them to feel respected from the very beginning. And for several seconds, nothing followed. That silence mattered, because the second party suddenly understood that your name was no longer being carried as a temporary thought. You were being considered alongside family, responsibility, timing, and the future. Don't skip, because what happened afterward explains why that private conversation with God became so emotional. The second party asked a question they had avoided asking until then: have you really thought that far ahead? The answer did not come quickly. The person you love paused, almost as though revealing too much would expose feelings they had carefully protected. Then came a quiet admission: they had thought about meeting the people closest to you. They had imagined the nervousness of that first conversation. They had wondered whether your family would understand their intentions. They had even considered what they would need to prove, not through impressive words, but through consistency. Before asking anyone to trust them with a meaningful place in your life. That was the detail that changed the second party's perspective. This was not merely someone thinking about romance. This was someone thinking about responsibility. Yet something even more unexpected followed. The second party did not immediately respond with approval. Instead, they asked why your family mattered so much. That question opened a door the person you love had apparently kept closed for quite some time. They explained that whenever they thought about you, they could not separate the person you are now from the people, experiences, and values that helped shape you. They understood that being welcomed into your life could eventually mean being respectful toward the people you care about as well. And then they admitted something surprisingly vulnerable: one of their greatest concerns was not whether they could express their feelings to you. It was whether, when the time came, their actions would make the people who love you feel comfortable believing those feelings were sincere. Stay till the end, because the second party remembered those exact words later when speaking to God. Suddenly, the secret promise about your family was no longer abstract. They knew precisely what they wanted to promise. But there was still resistance inside them. A person does not abandon old assumptions in a single moment. They remembered everything they had previously believed about this connection. They remembered conversations where your name had raised questions. They remembered wondering whether emotions were moving faster than reality. Yet now they were confronted with something they had not expected: patience. The person you love was not talking about forcing an outcome. They were talking about becoming ready for one. That distinction changed everything. And the second party quietly began wondering whether they had been measuring your connection by the wrong things. Perhaps they had been waiting for dramatic evidence while overlooking the small evidence already appearing everywhere: the careful way your name was mentioned, the seriousness surrounding family, the desire to avoid unnecessary conflict, the unusual thoughtfulness whenever your future entered the conversation. Those details began connecting like pieces that had been sitting separately for months. Then the second party asked one final question: and what if their family doesn't immediately understand? The person you love looked down for a moment before answering. Their response was not defensive. It was surprisingly gentle. They said they would give people time. They would answer questions honestly. They would not expect trust simply because they wanted it. And they would never want you placed in the middle, forced to choose between protecting the people you love and protecting the relationship you hope to build. That sentence stayed with the second party. Something important is waiting for you, because later, when they were alone, those words returned with unusual clarity. They realized that perhaps their role in this story was not to decide what should happen. Perhaps their role was simply to avoid making something already delicate more difficult than it needed to be. That was when they spoke to God again. This time there was less confusion in the prayer. They asked for wisdom to recognize sincerity when they saw it. They asked for humility if their earlier assumptions had been incomplete. And then they made the promise nobody else was supposed to hear: if the day came when your family needed reassurance about the person you love, and if they genuinely believed the intentions they had witnessed were sincere, they would tell the truth about what they had seen. They would speak about the private moments when your name was treated with seriousness. They would mention the conversations about respect. They would explain that the person you love had been thinking about approaching your family carefully long before anyone knew. They would not exaggerate. They would not promise an outcome they could not guarantee. They would simply refuse to hide the good they had witnessed. Pause on that realization. The second party, who once seemed positioned outside your connection, had quietly promised to become a truthful witness if your family ever needed one. Not an advocate blindly defending everything. Not someone controlling the story. A witness. Someone willing to say, "I saw how seriously they thought about this." That difference matters. Because sometimes the strongest support does not come from the person who always agreed with you. Sometimes it comes from the person who questioned everything, watched carefully, and eventually realized there was more sincerity present than they expected. The person you love does not yet fully understand the promise that was made after that conversation. They only know the second party has become noticeably different whenever your name appears. And that change has already begun showing itself. A question that once might have sounded skeptical now sounds curious. A conversation that once would have ended quickly now continues a little longer. When your family is mentioned, the second party no longer treats the subject as distant or irrelevant. They listen. They remember details. They seem almost to be preparing themselves for something. But here is where another mystery entered the story. During one recent conversation, the second party asked the person you love a question so specific that it caught them completely off guard: if you were sitting across from their family tomorrow, what would you want them to know about you first? The person you love did not answer immediately. They smiled nervously, then became serious. For a moment, it seemed they might avoid the question entirely. But eventually they gave an answer that revealed far more than expected. They said they would not begin by explaining what they could offer you. They would begin by explaining what they admired about you. They would tell your family that they had noticed your strength without wanting to take advantage of it, your kindness without assuming it had no limits, and your loyalty without expecting it automatically. They would explain that knowing you had made them examine themselves more carefully. And then came the line the second party was not prepared for, would want them to know that I'm not trying to take someone away from their family. I would hope, with time, to become someone their family could also trust. The second party carried that sentence away in silence. Later, it became part of the prayer. And something changed after they repeated it. They realized the secret promise they had made might someday require more than staying neutral. There could come a moment when somebody misunderstands the person you love, when nervousness creates the wrong impression, or when two families approach the same situation carrying completely different expectations. If that happened, the second party had quietly decided they would help calm the conversation rather than deepen the misunderstanding. They would remind everyone of what had been said privately when nobody was performing for approval. They would protect what was sincere without pretending everything was perfect. No one expected that particular person to notice first. They had remained almost completely outside the conversations, rarely asking questions and never giving anyone a clear indication of what they understood. Yet somehow, they had been paying attention. Not to rumors, not to assumptions, but to the smallest changes surrounding the person you love. They noticed how certain conversations became quieter whenever your name came close to the surface. They noticed how questions about the future were no longer answered casually. And then, without warning, they asked the second party something incredibly simple: who is this person everyone keeps being so careful about? The second party froze for a moment. Not because your existence was forbidden knowledge, but because suddenly the promise made privately to God felt closer to being tested. Don't skip, because instead of revealing everything, the second party chose their words carefully. They said there was someone important, someone whose presence had caused the person you love to think differently about relationships, responsibility, and family. They did not exaggerate your role. They did not turn you into a perfect character. They simply described what they had witnessed. And strangely, that honesty made the other person even more curious. The next question went straight to the heart of everything: does their family know? The second party could have dismissed it. Instead, they admitted that family had already become part of the private conversation surrounding you. That answer created a silence that felt different from all the others. Because once families enter a conversation, people understand that feelings may be moving beyond imagination toward something requiring maturity. The second party remembered their prayer immediately. They remembered promising not to create unnecessary misunderstanding if this moment ever arrived. So they did something they would not have done earlier. They defended the pace of your story. They explained that nobody should be rushed, that meaningful connections deserve room to develop naturally, and that your family should never be treated like an obstacle waiting at the end of a relationship. They should be treated as people whose trust matters. The person listening seemed surprised. Perhaps they had expected gossip. Instead, they were hearing respect. And then came the question that changed the atmosphere completely: what has this person done to make them think so seriously? The second party smiled, because there was no single dramatic answer. That was precisely what made the situation difficult to explain. It was not one grand gesture. It was a collection of small things. The way the person you love became more thoughtful after certain conversations with you. The way they started speaking differently about patience. The way they began considering how their decisions might affect people beyond themselves. The way they sometimes protected your privacy even when revealing more would have made explaining everything easier. Something important is waiting for you here. Because the second party finally realized that your strongest influence had not been loud enough for everyone to see. It had been quiet enough to change someone from within. That realization brought them back to the secret promise. They had originally believed the promise was about protecting your family from unnecessary tension. Now they understood another side of it. They wanted to protect the dignity of your connection too. Not by hiding reality, but by refusing to let incomplete information define it. So when the questions continued, they carefully said something nobody expected: whatever happens, I think they deserve the chance to explain this themselves. Those words mattered. The second party had been given an opportunity to control the narrative, and they refused it. They could have become the person who revealed everything first. Instead, they preserved a conversation that belonged to you and the person you love. Later, the person you love learned that questions had been asked. Their first reaction was nervousness. "What did you tell them?" they asked. The second party answered, "Only what was mine to tell." That response created another long silence. Then the person you love asked whether your family had been mentioned. The second party nodded. For a brief moment, concern appeared on their face. Not because they were ashamed of you, but because they had hoped any conversation involving your family would happen carefully. And that reaction confirmed something the second party had been wondering about. Your family was not a casual detail to this person. Their opinion mattered. Their comfort mattered. The possibility of earning their trust mattered. Stay till the end, because this was when the second party almost revealed the prayer. They nearly told the person you love everything. That your name had been spoken before God, that your family had been included, that a promise had already been made about how they would behave if the situation became more serious. But they stopped. Something told them the promise needed to remain private a little longer, not because it was shameful, but because they wanted their actions to prove it before their words announced it. So instead they asked, "Are you still serious about approaching their family respectfully when the time is right?" The answer came faster this time: yes. One word. No speech. No hesitation. And somehow that single answer carried more weight than everything said before it. The second party then asked what "the right time" actually meant. The person you love explained that they did not want to arrive with uncertainty and expect your family to provide reassurance. They wanted to understand their own intentions first. They wanted to know what they could realistically promise and what they could not. They wanted to approach the people who care about you with honesty instead of polished words designed merely to impress them. That maturity surprised the second party again. The more they listened, the more their original assumptions continued falling away. Then something unexpectedly tender surfaced. The person you love admitted that they had imagined meeting one particular member of your family first. Not because that person was necessarily the easiest to impress, but because they sensed that this individual understood you deeply. They believed that if they could sit across from someone who truly knew your character and answer their questions without hiding, then whatever happened afterward would at least begin from truth. They had even wondered what that family member might ask. What do you value about them? What are your intentions? How do you handle disagreement? Are you prepared to respect the life they already have instead of trying to reshape everything around yourself? These were not questions the person you love feared. They were questions they had quietly begun preparing themselves to answer. The second party listened and remembered another part of their prayer, a part even they had nearly forgotten. They had asked God for one specific thing. If this connection was healthy and sincere, let the people involved become more honest, more patient, and more respectful because of it. Sitting there now, hearing the person you love speak, they wondered whether that prayer was already changing the way they themselves approached the situation. They were no longer searching for reasons to judge quickly. They were watching more carefully, listening more patiently, leaving space for people to reveal who they really were. But then the conversation turned toward you personally. The second party asked, "Does this person know how much you've thought about their family?" The person you love became completely still. Their answer was quiet, "Probably not." And suddenly the second party understood why so much of this story had remained hidden. You may have seen uncertainty where someone else was privately trying to become certain. You may have noticed silence without knowing what questions were being considered inside it. You may have wondered whether family ever entered their thoughts when, behind the scenes, family had become one of the reasons they were moving so carefully. That does not guarantee what happens next. It does reveal something meaningful about what has already happened. Conversations have changed. Assumptions have softened. A second party who once stood at a distance has privately promised to protect dignity rather than create tension. And the person you love has begun thinking about how to face the people closest to you with honesty. Yet the most unexpected development was still ahead. Because shortly after this conversation ended, the second party received a message from the very person who had originally asked about you. The message contained only a few words, but those words immediately brought the secret promise back into focus. "I think I know who they are." The second party stared at the message longer than they expected. They had not given your name. They had not shown a photograph. They had deliberately protected details. So how had this person figured it out? The answer came in a second message. Apparently, weeks earlier, they had witnessed one tiny interaction involving the person you love. An interaction nobody considered important at the time. But now, looking back, it made perfect sense. And what they remembered from that moment was not merely enough to identify you. It had also given them an impression of you before anyone had the chance to influence their opinion. The second party immediately wondered what that impression had been. Positive? Uncertain? Curious? They typed a question, erased it, typed another, then finally asked, "What exactly did you notice?" The reply did not arrive immediately. Minutes passed. And when it finally appeared, the second party read it twice, because the answer connected your family, the person you love, and that private promise in a way nobody had anticipated. The person had noticed something about how the person you love behaved immediately after seeing you, something so subtle that everyone else overlooked it. And according to them, that tiny change revealed exactly why your family had suddenly become such an important part of these hidden conversations. But there is still one thing the second party has not told anyone. During that prayer, after speaking about you and your family, they mentioned one particular person connected to this situation. Someone whose opinion may matter more than anyone realizes. Someone the person you love has apparently been thinking about approaching first. And the second party already knows why. What they do not know is that this person may have noticed the connection long before anyone planned to explain it, and the question they recently asked about you could bring the entire hidden conversation much closer to the surface.